Ederle's gripping eyewitness account of Custer's final stand. On June 25, 1876, the vast plains of Montana bore witness to an epic confrontation, the Battle of Little Bighorn. As the dust settled and the silence of the prairie returned, Lieutenant Winfield Scott Ederle stood among the few survivors of Custer's ill-fated 7th Cavalry. In this vivid first-hand narrative, Ederle recounts the harrowing events of that fateful day, from the initial skirmishes to the desperate, chaotic final moments. With raw honesty and striking detail, he brings to life the courage, confusion, and tragedy that marked this infamous chapter of American history. Prepare to uncover a profound historical revelation as we revisit the events of 1876. Don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel for more captivating explorations of history. June 25, 1876, morning, around 10 a.m., our forces were approximately 15 miles from the enemy encampment. The entire regiment was together as we halted, and General Custer climbed a nearby hill with his scouts to survey the Indian village, which was clearly visible in the distance. Upon returning, he convened a meeting with his officers. He informed us that the Indians had spotted our approach and that his scouts had briefly pursued a few of them, but they had escaped and warned the rest of the camp. Custer insisted we must launch a direct attack on the village without delay. He was confident the Indians would not mount significant resistance against our regiment and would likely flee at the sight of our forces. General Custer issued orders for the troop commanders to ready their men immediately. Within moments, the regiment was prepared to move. Custer, alongside his adjutant Lieutenant Colonel Cook, divided the force into 4 battalions, assigning command to Major Reno, Lieutenant Colonel Benteen, Major Keogh, and Captain Yates. The strategy unfolds. Major Reno was ordered to lead his battalion straight down the valley and launch the initial attack on the village, with support to follow. Lieutenant Colonel Benteen was directed to veer off to the left at a 45-degree angle from Reno's path and engage any Indians he encountered, anticipating the enemy would scatter in both directions. Meanwhile, Captain McDougal and his troop were tasked with guarding the pack train as a rearguard. The assignments given to Major Keogh and Captain Yates remain unclear, but they departed with Custer, leading 5 companies and around 250 to 300 men advancing in a direction parallel to Reno's route. The last sight I had of General Custer alive was as he moved off with this group. Following his orders, Lieutenant Colonel Benteen maneuvered his battalion across a series of high ridges, dispatching Lieutenant Gibson to scout for enemy positions from the hilltops. Lieutenant Gibson reported repeatedly that no Indians were visible along our path. Lieutenant Colonel Benteen then turned right, and about 5 or 6 miles from the starting point, we encountered Major Reno's trail and followed it at a rapid pace. As we trailed, a trumpeter from General Custer's staff arrived with a note for Benteen. It read, "Come on, big village. Be quick. Bring packs." It was signed by Lieutenant Colonel Cook, the adjutant. Urged by the message, we pressed on, and about 3 miles from the village, we saw signs of battle in the valley. Shortly after, we spotted over 100 men making a frantic dash for the bluffs on the far side of the Little Bighorn River, where the Indian village lay. They crossed the stream and disappeared into the hills. From our position on the opposite bank, some distance away, the orderly who delivered the note assured us that Custer's men had surprised the village and were prevailing. Assuming the fleeing men were Indians being pursued by our troops, we advanced quickly. We headed toward the ford where Reno's men had crossed, intending to offer support. However, as we approached, a Crow scout, half-yellow face, signaled us to move up to a hill on our right. We turned and ascended. Reaching the summit, we found Lieutenant Colonel Reno and his men tending to wounded soldiers, many of whom were desperately pleading for water. To our astonishment, we learned that Reno's force had been forced to retreat from their earlier position. While we were regrouping, sporadic gunfire continued as Indians hidden among the rocks and hills harassed us. We quickly formed a skirmish line and drove them off. Then, heavy gunfire erupted from the direction where we would later discover the remains of General Custer's unit. Through the haze of dust, we could make out horsemen moving back and forth across the far side of the river about 4 miles away. During this time, Captain Weir, my commander, asked for my opinion. I suggested that we should make every effort to support Custer. He agreed, as did our first sergeant, and asked if I would be willing to lead D Troop down to assist Custer if permission could be secured. I agreed, and Captain Weir immediately approached Lieutenant Colonels Reno and Benteen for approval. Shortly after, Weir returned, mounted his horse, and set off with an orderly in the direction of the gunfire. Assuming he had received permission, I mobilized D Troop and followed him. After a short distance, we turned into a small valley, likely the route Custer's men had taken earlier, and approached the main Indian force we had observed from afar. As we advanced, Colonel Weir, still positioned on the bluff to our left, spotted a large contingent of Indians approaching. He signaled for us to retreat to his position, which we did promptly. Upon reaching the bluff, we encountered Lieutenant Colonel Benteen, Captain French, and Lieutenant Godfrey advancing with their troops. We moved along the ridge, but the Indians soon began firing at us. We dismounted and formed a defensive line along the crest, exchanging fire for about half an hour. Eventually, on General Reno's orders, we withdrew to our original position. During the retreat, we lost one man and one horse, and the Indians pursued us relentlessly, firing their Winchesters. Once we rejoined Reno's forces, we saw the other troops forming a defensive line along the hill's crest. Weir's and Godfrey's units extended the line alongside ours. The Indians soon launched a fierce attack, their bullets whizzing overhead. The battle raged for over an hour, with the intensity subsiding as night fell. That marked the end of the first day's fighting. The following morning, before dawn, the Indians launched another assault, firing relentlessly from a distance. The skirmish continued until around 10 a.m., marking the start of another grueling day of battle. After the morning exchange of gunfire, the battlefield grew eerily quiet, with only small groups of Indians visible on the ridges around us. By afternoon, activity dwindled further. Across the river, the Indian camp began to dismantle as the tribes prepared to depart. By 4 p.m., they had moved on. From our position, we suffered relatively few casualties during the previous day's fighting. That evening, we relocated to a nearby position and held there overnight. The next morning brought grim news. Lieutenant Bradley, commander of General Terry's scouts, arrived and informed us that General Custer and his entire unit had been killed. Shortly thereafter, General Terry arrived with his column and directed our regiment to bury the dead. The grim task began with the discovery of Lieutenants Calhoun and Crittenden among the fallen of L Troop. The officers' bodies were positioned just behind their men, still in a precise skirmish line, a haunting testament to where they had made their final stand. Lieutenant Crittenden's body bore multiple arrow wounds, a brutal reminder of the ferocity of the battle. As we moved through the battlefield, we found Colonel Keogh and his troop. It appeared they had been retreating toward the hill where General Custer made his last stand, fighting every step of the way. Scattered across the ground, the bodies of soldiers followed a grim path toward the same hill. At the summit, we found the bodies of General Custer, his adjutant Lieutenant Colonel Cook, Colonel Tom Custer, several enlisted men and horses. Nearby, at the base of the hill, lay the remains of Lieutenant Riley, Captain Yates, numerous enlisted men, and more horses. General Custer's younger brother, Boston, and his nephew, Reed, were discovered about 100 yards from his body. While most of the bodies were stripped of their uniforms, leaving the soldiers naked or wearing only undershirts, socks, and drawers, Colonel Tom Custer and Lieutenant Colonel Cook's bodies showed evidence of particularly brutal treatment. The battlefield was situated on the east side of the river, below the main village and approximately 4 miles from Reno's position, a sobering conclusion to a devastating encounter. On the afternoon of June 25th, as I rode out with the troop, the battlefield was alive with motion. I saw numerous Indians galloping back and forth, firing at objects on the ground. At the time, it was impossible to discern what they were targeting. Later, upon reaching the top of the hill where Reno's men were stationed, I heard an intense burst of gunfire lasting 15 to 20 minutes before it abruptly ceased. After burying General Custer and his men on the east side of the river, our regiment crossed to the west side to tend to the fallen from Reno's command. There, we buried around 40 men. Among the discoveries were 2 Indian teepees, each containing the bodies of warriors, ornately dressed and fastened upright to poles. Chief Low Dog later explained that this was a traditional and honorable method of laying brave warriors to rest, leaving their remains to the enemy. It was a sight I had never encountered before. I suspect the teepees and bodies were left behind because the Indians fled hastily, alarmed by the arrival of General Terry's column. Surrounding the teepees were numerous dead ponies, positioned in a circular formation with their heads pointed toward the teepees, a peculiar yet solemn arrangement. Based on the sheer scale of what I observed, I estimated the Indian force to number around 7,000 warriors. In stark contrast, General Terry's command, consisting of roughly 500 men, seemed minuscule by comparison. The Indians later recounted that General Custer's trail revealed he had advanced along the east bank of the river, a narrow waterway only 15 to 20 yards wide in that area. Meanwhile, Reno's men had crossed to the west bank to launch their attack. The steepness of the riverbanks rendered most areas inaccessible, save for a ford located about 3 miles from Reno's position. It was at this ford that Custer likely attempted to cross, only to be attacked and driven back to the hill where his body was ultimately discovered. We encountered a grim path of fallen soldiers scattered from the ford to the site of Custer's final stand. Notably, Custer, who had cut his long hair short before the battle, was found naked, but his body bore no signs of mutilation, a rare mercy amid the otherwise brutal aftermath of the fight. Thank you for watching the video until the end. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you won't miss any new videos from us. What do you think about today's topic? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. And if you found the video helpful, feel free to share it with your friends and family. We hope you had a great time. See you in the next video with even more exciting content. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss out.